Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Darius Mensah. He served in public safety and is from the back of an ambulance, as he says, all the way to special ed, school designer, and school administrator. It was really an honor and a blessing to have this conversation, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Please welcome Dr. Darius Mensah. Thank you so much for being with us, Darius, on this podcast. We're exploring the purpose of public education in your practice. I'm really grateful that you were referred here, and I want to point out that your practice has been in service of our young people for years. So I just want to thank you for your service. As we begin, could you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and your connection to public education?
Certainly. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Darius Mensah. I've been an educator since 2006. I came into public education after spending 15 years working on the ambulance in the large cities of New Jersey. It was quite the transition from working in the public safety healthcare in interchange to the classroom. But I jokingly tell people I learned more about classroom from the back of the ambulance than I did from grad school. Just this idea of how do you meet people where they are, meet their needs for their interest, right? Since I've come into the classroom, I've been a special ed teacher, I've been an administrator, I've been a school designer. We've moved back and forth from the East Coast to the West Coast, back to the East Coast, and now we're here. Currently, I am an assistant principal in a school district in the Seattle area, and I recently completed my doctorate in ed this past summer.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm curious about school designer. Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I had this amazing opportunity. One of the reasons that we moved back to the East Coast actually was because of a grant that my former school got. This was a school where I started off as a teacher. It was a high school, and we got a grant to look at college and career readiness disparities affecting Black and brown boys. So I was recruited back by my principal to come and administer that grant, and that grant led to a fellowship where 10 of us designed a school model looking at the same challenge. How do we create environments that help to close those gaps between who's ready for college and career? We ended up opening 3 schools with that model, and then after I left the city, they opened up a charter school with the same model. So those schools are still running; they're still thriving.
So from that experience and that perspective, really broad perspective, not only in education but your previous career, public health, and then special ed, school design. Here's the big question: is what, from your perspective, what is the purpose of public education?
This is a complex question. I'm going to preface it by saying that I've been accused of being negative about public ed, and that's not the case. I'm actually very optimistic about the potential of what we do. I am, however, critical, and I'm critical because it's too important, right? It's like any of these entities that we have that are a potential public good that can do great harm if we're not vigilant about what's happening, right? And so in that spirit, I look at 2 contrasting ideals that define public ed, right? There is this originalist ideal. When we think of originalism, we think of typically constitutional law, right? So like Scalia Justice Scalia, he was an originalist. He believes in the original intent of the authors, right? And so if you go back into history, we're looking at preparing children to be workers, right? To maintain stratification. When you go all the way back to the Puritans, it was about teaching people to read so they could read the Bible. But another part of original intent is the factory model of teaching and learning. Another part of original intent is questioning who had access, right? So at first it was males, right? There was a time when if you taught a Black person to read, you could be punished for that. So original intent is problematic. There are positive pieces of it. This idea that at some point someone said everyone should have a baseline of learning, but there are a lot of flaws in the thinking about who and when and how. So there's that. And then there's this aspirational ideal that I think most educators, if you sit them down one-on-one, will tell you something akin to this purpose of preparing all students to take leadership in their world, right? Some may drill down further. They may try to take actions to separate the demographics from the outcomes, right? So maybe it's the explicit things like race or national origin or home language, or even those proxies like your zip code, things that mask who the human being is, trying to separate those things out so that your race is not a predictor of your access to a healthy life, right? I'll go further and say that there's a need to separate out what we call intelligence testing or standardized testing as a predictor as well. I mean, both of those things have a troublesome history, and they're real attempts at separating and stratifying with a biased tool. So that's an aspirational ideal. And I say it's aspirational simply because we're not there yet, right? We still cling to a lot of the originalist ideal. And I say we because as much as I think I am enlightened about certain things, I'm also complicit in the products that we are currently putting out there, right? And we're making progress. These conversations, things happening in school districts and schoolhouses and classrooms that are challenging the status quo. There's a lot of progress towards the aspirational ideal, but we're far from there. I think there's a piece that's worth calling out here is that when you contrast this originalist ideal and this aspirational ideal, you're also bearing in mind the times that these things came to be. The industrial age required workers. We're in the information age. And so another purpose, I guess, of public ed right now, as we hopefully adapt from originalism to this aspirational goal, is to rethink how we educate the students coming to us. Because making machines and using information are two entirely different beasts. And if we're still equipping kids what was going on 100 years ago, then we're failing them.
I agree wholeheartedly. I don't think we know what their futures are going to be in 30, 40 years. I was recently at a wedding and you get all this mix of kids and I'm just watching them 3, 5, 7 years old. And I'm just really wondering, like, what is life going to be like that for them in 30 years? And how are schools preparing them for that? And especially with this factory model. So as we look to innovation, and I see things all over the place. I know there are some districts in Washington state that are giving telehealth, mental health care for acute needs in students, on school grounds, on the day, giving access. So mental health is something very much of interest about how do we have a school-based comprehensive infrastructure. That's one area. So many other areas, and thinking about like disrupting this 6-period school day in secondary. Like, what are we doing? All the bells. Like, what are we doing when we know that learning for their futures must occur in a different way? So what have you, especially as a school designer, that, I'm really curious about that, administrator, obviously, but what have you seen really work in empowering, creating stable human beings where they can derive their own meaning and fulfillment, I think, as well as a sense of service and responsibility and connection to the world. So I'm curious, in your experience, what have you seen really work for schools, for teachers, for young people?
Yeah, I think things I've seen work. I mean, I'll go back to being a special ed teacher during the pandemic, right? Now, my sample size is admittedly small, but a lot of what I worked with, a lot of the students who came to me for social and emotional skills. At the time, I was working in a school that had a lot of kids coming in with a lot of trauma, right? The neighborhood is being gentrified. It's one of those neighborhoods, like so many others, that was carved out by redlining and is being violently shaped by gentrification now, right? So there's a lot of instability, a lot of trauma coming in. So of the students on my caseload, maybe half of them came to me just for social emotional skills. And if you step back a little bit, you could see that these are very intelligent, very astute kids who can make sense of the things around them. There's nothing stopping them from acquiring academic skills other than this thing about the mechanized way of schools, right? Things that only exist because we have to move hundreds of kids through time and space to do things. So what I saw for some of them when pandemic happened and we had to rethink how we do schools, some of them transitioned into online schooling, right? So not attending online classes in their school. My school district created an online school, very much at, things that took advantage of asynchronous learning, and they built structures around it. I mean, it's a really well done thing. I mean, it's one of the reasons why when I had an opportunity to seek promotion in another school district, I decided to stay put because I liked the direction that the district was taking. And what, checking in with the parents and again, this is a small sample size, but their children were doing better, removed from the mechanics of school. So I think we have to be humble enough as educators to say that the system that we run to move kids through this doesn't serve all kids. It doesn't serve the learning needs of all kids. And that's a place of humility that oftentimes, buttressed by the machine behind us, we don't take. I think another thing that I've seen work, and this has been, various places that I've worked in, shifting the work towards the relational. It seems silly saying this, right? This is human work. Mm-hmm. And I think we know that kids learn when they're in relationship with other humans. But I see this spectrum between transactional work and relational work, right? And it's not a value judgment because we need both. When you think of how we pay people, that's a transactional thing by necessity, right? If you work X number of hours in X number of place doing X work, you get this amount of money for it. And in fact, if we shift that from the transactional to the relational, where we start to say, because I like you more, if you do X number of hours of X work in X place, I'm going to pay you this plus something else, then we get ourselves into serious trouble. But only some things are transactional, and there's this whole spectrum, right? And so I think if you go all the way to this other end of relational, teaching and learning ideally is relational work. Now, what I think we lose sight of is this idea that, anything that operates as a system strives for efficiency, and relational work is not always efficient. And so there's work that we have to do to defend what should be relational work from that draw back towards transactional work. And sometimes that means we have to translate what is transactional into relational also. A good idea of that is curriculum. There are curriculum products out there that are really strong things that used well do move kids, but also built so that you could just read curriculum to kids. That's transactional work, but it's in the frame of teaching and learning. There's a relational piece that I've got to know this child. I've got to know my children. I've got to know who's coming in and what they're coming in here with in order for me to make sense of that. And I guess to bring it to the areas where I'm sensitive, too often, when we fail to translate that, when we fail to protect the relational nature of teaching and learning, we oftentimes exclude more marginalized students who may look like me, or students who live on that side of the tracks, or students whose last names are just a bit more exotic. Because the people who are writing curriculum, they are more culturally similar to students who are not going to be left behind. And so I guess that it's a long way of saying, culturally responsive teaching and learning moves kids, right? So part of that relational work is abandoning this assumption that kids come in as blank slates, right? Mm-hmm. That their parents haven't taught them anything, that the community hasn't taught them anything. When we recognize a child coming in with a whole bunch of cultural wealth, we're doing a couple of things here. One, a child will feel safe when their entire being is welcomed, right? So if I welcome your body in the seat, but not everything that you've brought with you, your experiences, your learnings, the way that you make sense of the world, if I tell you to leave that outside, if I reject that, you're not going to feel safe. And if you're not safe, I can't ask you to do higher level work, right? In fact, what I'm asking you to do, if I reject a significant amount of who you are, is I'm asking you to act like you have no compass. And when you have no compass, you're going to act up, right? So when we see behaviors in school, I think that's a huge piece of it. So we need to create that safety, those preconditions for learning. That moves kids. I think we have to also be when practitioners are aware of certain things, aware of where our feet are and the challenges that we're facing. the result is that students learn effectively, right? So I think of something that was part of my admin training that has since become a part of my life, these ideals of adaptive leadership, right? So contrasting the technical challenge, which is something that we know how to solve, right? If we're in a dark room, we know how to find a light switch and flip it on. We know how to find our phone to turn on the flashlight. That's a technical challenge. I guess an adaptive challenge in the same context would be trying to find the reason why we're sitting in a dark room to start off with, right? So the adaptive challenges, which are typically the challenges of humanity, these things are messy. They may not have an easy answer. They may have no answer. They require this constant balancing of tensions and needs and the managing of loss, right? Again, if this work that we do of teaching and learning in public schools is transactional work, I would also say that it's highly adaptive work also, if we want to separate ourselves from the factory model, right? The factory model is applying technical solutions to an adaptive challenge. There's just a whole lot of management that we need to do. And we need to be able to manage our own loss and the loss that our peers experience of a lot of competence, even if it's competence in dysfunctional things.
Wow.
In order to do that work, right? And then there's just so much more that relates to our original sins, not only in public schooling, but since school is representative of society, original sins of our society also, right? So this idea of race and racism, we need to be able to talk about anti-Blackness and white supremacy and not shut a conversation down when those things come up, right? It's what the elders in my community used to say, calling the devil by his name, right? When we can name these things and look at the impact of it, we can start to act on it. So, there's a whole range of things that we do as educators that keep the work pure, that keep the work more towards the aspirational and start to pull away from the negative pieces of the originalist thinking that I've seen move kids.
Wow. Thank you so much. There's so much you said there. There was a beautiful metaphor, I think, about knowing the compass of children, right? Yes. Knowing what drives them, where they are in their own world, right? How they see themselves, how they orient themselves, and just understanding what they're coming in with. Really, I hear this kind of constructivist model, right? That we're going to write in their cultural wealth, their funds of knowledge through relationship. I'm also really curious about learning from COVID and how we just rubber band back to status quo and didn't take any of the learnings. I was working on a project with migrant youth across the state, we did it for 3 summers, and it worked really, really well, especially when we had the near peer mentor. So we had some college students serving as mentors, and they'd be in small groups of 5 or 6, and students looked forward to that dialogue, to that sharing time after the other kind of asynchronous components. And we're using the time online to be curious and ask questions. And we held a circle, essentially, like a digital circle, if you will. We just put names in the chat and everybody, and we held really true to this practice of circle, so that everybody had you can always pass, but everybody had an opportunity to share in their reflections. Managing loss is also really curious to me around change in systems, especially for educators that have been doing things a particular way for years, and saying, well, how do we adjust? And that's really profound insight, I think, around as shift occurs, for me, it's more than reform. I think we need a renaissance in education, but what I'm taking away is, like, as those shifts occur, how do we actually manage for loss of, and even though it may not have been working, of the old way?
Right. Yeah.
I think that's really profound insight for me. I'm really grateful that you shared this knowledge. Really, there's something really wise about that. So, what challenges do you see then to making these adaptations, and how do you respond to those as we try to innovate?
I think there are a couple of things, right? Maybe it's not a couple of things. I think maybe it's actually under this big flag of inertia, right? Or just desire to maintain, right? There's something seductive about doing work that is predictable, right?
Well, predictable for who as well,
Well, yes, right. But I mean, if I know that my metric as an educator is the pacing guide and only the pacing guide, right? Which, so that's not the case, right? But I think that there's a varying level of value to what chapter you're on what day, right? But if I know that that's my thing, all I have to do is get through that, and I can check the box and go home, that can be seductive, and that it has less of there's less intellectual burden for me. I don't have to balance a whole bunch of other things there, right? And I think we're all susceptible to it. We try to simplify our lives because our lives are increasingly complex. So there's no judgment there of the human beings who are teachers in systems, right? A very wise person who was a mentor, who served as a mentor of mine. I don't know that if he knows that that's the case. But one day when I was rallying about the system this, the system that, he stopped me and reminded me, well, what's a system? The system is made of people, right? And so for me, it was a very humbling check to say, yeah, you know what? I'm complicit in this because on my worst days, maybe I'm checking boxes too, right? The maintenance of the status quo through doing those, taking the path of least resistance lends our practice to that traditionalist sense. What's the most efficient way for me to move these 30 kids through this curriculum in this time frame and then do it again next fall, right? Or to get them to standardized testing so that the little colored bars on the page are long enough that someone says, I did a good job, right? What's the most efficient way of doing that? The challenge, of course, I mean, as we've discussed, is that if we're really doing that for all of our children, if the aspirational intent is that all of our children are equipped by the time they're done with us to lead in their worlds, right? And knowing that they're coming from different places and they're coming in with different types of community wealth, and we have to balance all of that stuff. And, we can't do the same thing for all 30 kids. We may not even be able to do the same thing for the 2 kids sitting at the same table. I've got to embrace that work. And I think oftentimes as we are losing comfort, as we're losing competence in the dysfunctional, there's a temptation to do work avoidance, right? And so all of this stuff here that when we talk about loss, we talk about the adaptive challenge, the technical challenge. There's a Harvard scholar, Ronald Heifetz, who is kind of the father of this adaptive leadership work. But he talks about this idea that, you know what, people will do things to avoid the work, right? There's also a danger to it as you're leading this adaptive work that if you're not managing loss well, some people may actually take you out. Right? And so when you see leaders falling, right, or when you see someone rising up to advocate going back to a simpler way, these are responses to leading through an adaptive challenge. But this is a huge piece as we're trying to keep teaching and learning, or in some cases, get teaching and learning to a relational place where all of our students are able to come in, all of our students are able to get what they need to get to go back out into their communities and lead. These are the challenges that you're going to face. There's some other challenges that I think are highlighted by some of critical race theory, and not the Fox News version of it that they swear that we're teaching kids in school, but the actual legal scholarship that comes from Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and a bunch of other people. And I'm really enamored with 2 tenets there of CRT. One is this idea that racism is permanent, right? That while we know that race is a construct, there's no genetic marker for being black or white or anything else, that race was something that's made up. We have invested so much value in race, that we've built entire systems on race. Wilkerson talks about the caste system that we live in here that's built on race, right? It's that has anti-blackness at one pole, white supremacy at the other pole. That we have to own up to the fact that our feet are in this mess, right? Racism informs a lot of the implicit and explicit, biases that affect how we operate in schools, right? So things from low expectations to invisibility to outright hostility towards kids in school. We have to be able to own this. We have to be able to say the language, right? And I think we're getting more comfortable with it. One of the reasons I'm optimistic about public education is that there are more circles in which we're becoming more comfortable speaking this language without necessarily feeling accused. So people have two great fears, right? Public speaking and being called a racist, right? But being called a racist is very different than understanding that we operate in a world where racism has become our air. And if we know that, then we know how to navigate. I guess there's also this other piece where, much like any other system that has a potential for great public good, on the flip side of that is it can be a weapon also, right? So we think of law enforcement, right, as something that, despite a troubled history coming out of slave patrols, and we know, everything up to what we see on the news, there's a troubled history there. The potential of public safety is a public good, right? And as critical as I am of law enforcement, for example, I'm very critical of it. When something's going down too close to me, I'm calling 911. It's just the way it is. Coming from working in the ambulance, I know a number of people who have become cops, and some of them have accused me of being anti-cop. And no, it's just that it's too damn important to not be critical of the end result. Well, educators don't like to hear this, but there are a lot of parallels between American law enforcement and American public ed. Right? I think if we lose sight of that, or if we ignore that, if we try to act like it's not there, we do it at our peril. Right? We have a troubled history. We have communities who don't trust us for good reason, right? We have this history of exclusion, inequality, dehumanizing, right? There's a whole chapter on taking Native people and trying to dehumanize them, right? To literally trying to forcefully remove their culture under abusive hands, right? So, we can't ignore that this is part of our history. This is part of the efficient way of creating people who fit a mold, and if we cannot face that, then how are we going to educate all of our kids and equip all of our kids with the leadership skills they need to make changes in their world? I guess all that still falls under that flag of maintaining the status quo, right? So maybe that's the big challenge with some threads inside of it.
So I'm hearing a call to face history, especially our racialized history.
Yeah.
I know that dialogues and learning spaces, even with what I call the choir, I was recently among probably 60 educators, administrators. I mean, if you actually added up all the levels of service and education in this room, it would have been in the thousands of years of service working on a project that wants to center race and creating more teachers of color. Mm-hmm. And it was a 45-minute blow up that centered whiteness, that looked at the actual leadership in who was where, and realizing that we recreated a kind of hierarchy that mirrors other hierarchies.
Yeah.
In the front end, very, very clearly, there's an intentional to center race and try to deal with this. Resma Menicum's work for me is like, and the whole room is up. It's everybody's bodies are constricted, right? Everybody, because there's not a comfort. And where in my engagement and my facilitation and learning around this is dealing with the somatic experience. When we begin to enter these kind of learning dialogues, because it often just stops the conversation, right? And I think our young people are leading on this. I think they're really examining more clearly how racism is tied to all of our other forms of stratification, right? Patriarchy, heteronormativity, and really connecting queer liberation to Black liberation. And, just seeing all of these parallels. I'm curious, what other calls to action would you have in addition to facing our history?
Yeah. I mean, facing history, I think also facing our future, right? What you said, all our children are going to lead the way. I forget who it was who said this. All revolution is in the hands of the youth, right? We need to listen to our kids. We need, how do we act on behalf of our kids without listening to them, right? So it's a call. I guess it's more of a call for humility as well. You mentioned something as well, this idea of recruiting educators of color. Yeah, it's I'm not versed enough to quote all of the data on who's in the classroom, but I do know from my research that 2% of our American teaching force are Black males. I also know that there's that study out of Hopkins that talks about the effect of having a single Black teacher in your K through 12 experience on long-term outcomes, right? And this is for all students, right? We need to diversify the teaching force. Assuming best case, the current teaching force, the best case being that all educators truly agree intellectually that we need to change practices in order to properly equip all of our students to lead in their worlds, right? Assuming there's an intellectual understanding of it, the intellectual understanding is not sufficient, right? We still need action. And so I think we're more likely to be drawn towards sustaining action if you have an educator of color next to you. Even more so if there is a constituency of educators who represent the community. I think it also helps kids feel safer, right? I mean, every educator of color I know has kids in their building who come find them. Every educator of color I know has kids in their building who are not on their class roster, who have no business in the structure of the school day to be in their presence, but who come find them. And in every school that I've been in, there have been kids that have come to find me. The one time when that was, I guess, least evident was when I worked in a school that was, in fact, I guess, like 90-something% Black, that also had, I think, if I remember correctly, I think at one time we had 8 Black teachers, right? And so maybe because everyone could find somebody, right? And this is not too, I mean, I know there are also teachers, there are also white teachers who make those connections and have students who come find them, but I know the reasons why the kids come find me, right? Rebuilding these pipelines, right? Things that pre-1954 were robust because teachers taught in their communities, right? So that, the educator was a person of the community going into the schoolhouse. And so you had an agent of the community in the schoolhouse, not an agent of the school system in the community. Integration, one of the side effects of that was dismantling this pipeline, right? In school to say, yeah, you know what, you're a high school student. Have you ever thought about coming back here to teach? Because if you have, we might have something for you. And we send you to the local college. You go through your program, you get your credential, and you come back to a place that you are culturally immersed in to do the most important work, right? I think another piece also is developing leaders who can balance urgency with the long view, right? If you don't maintain a long view, all this work becomes the initiative of the year. The challenge of the initiative of the year is that anyone who is clinging to the status quo, anyone who is subject to inertia can wait that out. 180 days is not a long time, So you really need to invest in this long arc of leadership that goes beyond one fiscal year or a superintendent's contract or whatever the case is, because this is generational work. We're not going to undo centuries of malfeasance in one career, definitely not in one school year. Right.
Well, thank you for that. That's thanks. Whew, you're bringing it today. Thank you. I'm curious how, did you go to public school, and what's schooling's impact on you? Like specifically, what did it do for your spirit? Like just your overall well-being?
Yeah, so I had a mixture, right? My K-12 career was bookended by public schools, and I had urban private school experiences in the city of Newark that, all of which kind of led to this thing. And there was definitely a contrast, but not where you might think. I grew up in the late 1970s through the 1980s in a place called East Orange, New Jersey. And, the 70s and the 80s were a good time to be a Black kid in East Orange, right? My high school principal was Mr. Hamilton. Last I checked, Mr. Hamilton's still there, right? He could have retired 20 years ago. Dude just keeps on showing up to work, right? Again, an educator in the community. He's a proud Black man. I think I only saw him not wearing a suit once. And that was when I was 15 working as a supermarket cashier and he was picking up milk. Any other time I've seen this guy dressed to the nines. And one of the earliest memories I have of Mr. Hamilton was first grade, 1979, first grade. He came into our classroom and he sat down with us and he had a conversation on the topic of excellence. right? I'm 50 years old, so that's like 44 years ago, and it's burnt into my brain. But by the time we were done with that conversation, he had us convinced we were the smartest kids in the whole state. And he kept that message going through the entire thing, that we knew that we were beautiful kids, that we were his pride and joy, that we were intelligent, and that most importantly, we were excellent. And I'm pretty sure that even if you struggled to learn to read in Mr. Hamilton's school, you knew that you were excellent in some way. That's just a spirit that he brought into the school. It's a spirit that he had his teachers lead him with also, right? It was cultural relevance before we had coined the phrase. From that, I went to a very small boys' choir school in Newark. It was right in downtown Newark. And if you know anything about Newark's history, Newark is one of the cities that burned in the late 60s. And the time that I was there in the mid 80s, almost 20 years later, I guess 15 years later, Newark had still not healed, right? We had this slogan that Newark was the Renaissance city, but the Renaissance at that point had kind of stalled out. And I remember, while we're learning songs in Latin and while we're learning songs in German and Old English, and at some point Mandarin. While we're learning the world's music, we also had teachers who made sure we were immersed in what was happening under our feet. I remember one teacher, Mr. Smith, our social studies teacher, whose choice of curriculum and literature that we read was about us, right? Books I probably wouldn't recommend that you give to a preteen kid, but books that really called out the mess that we were standing in. So he was the first person who opened my eyes to my role as a Black male, as a Black boy, in a place that was marked by violence towards Black people. Right. From there, I went up the hill to to a high school run by the Benedictine monks in Newark. Also, that was actually right near the epicenter of the insurrection. Benedict's was an amazing place, in large part because of who was running it. Right. It's a bunch of monks, and the Benedictines take vows, but one of their vows is a vow of stability, right? A vow to stay put and serve where you are. And at the time that I was there, and actually still there now, were a bunch of monks who went to the school themselves during the riots, right? So they saw it firsthand. They saw the National Guard on school property. They saw Springfield Avenue burning. They got to experience all of that, and they came back. And for a period of time, around the time that I was born, for a period of time, the school had closed, and some of the monks in the abbey questioned whether they were going to remain stable in Newark as their congregants were fleeing. White flight was a real thing, right? And the abbey split. So there's another Benedictine abbey in the suburbs, and then there's the Newark Abbey of monks who stayed put and preserved the mission. And we opened the school with the mission of teaching the sons of Newark, even though the sons of Newark now look darker and speak different languages and have more exotic last names. And their big thing was leadership, right? I'm going to teach you to be a leader, right? Really, I mean, to the point where the students, like the senior students of this school, are trusted with more than you would trust most 16 and 17-year-olds to do, right? But of course, they charge tuition. My mom was a single mom. And so at some point, we had to make an economic decision. So we moved out of East Orange, where the schools were not up to my mother's standard. We moved literally 2 blocks into a neighboring city that was much more affluent, and that, at least when you look at the data, was doing better with their schools, right? So I could access their high school there. So my junior and senior year was spent there. I went to that school, met my guidance counselor, and he was also the head football coach. And he saw me coming in with my big shoulders, and he wanted to talk to me about football. And I told him I couldn't run, I couldn't throw, I can't catch, and I'm not playing ball. And we didn't have many more conversations about anything, really, not about football, but also not about college and what comes next. In fact, my course load my junior year, at least at the start of my junior year, included remedial reading. I think it was a general math class and some English class that was like talking about films, right? That didn't last because my mother is a Jamaican and she handled business the way only a Jamaican mother can. And so after that handling of the schedule, I was put back onto a college track. But when I graduated high school, I went to work because I didn't apply to college when I was in high school. And truth be told, in those 2 years that I was at that school, I barely graduated on time. So mind you, I came with all of my credits, came with all this momentum, all this building up, all of this leadership, all this beautiful stuff. And 2 years compared to the previous 11 years, 2 years of the expectation of mediocrity nearly stalled me out.
Wow.
So for me, it proved to me a couple of things. It's the importance of the representation, right? Seeing people who look like me. I was lucky that I need 2 hands to count the number of Black male teachers that I've had. So there's power there. It proved to me also that you can educate kids in ways that are culturally responsive, in ways that really move and motivate all of your kids. It also showed me clearly the damage that low expectations and this insistence on the originalist ideal can do to kids. Because if anyone was destined for success, it should have been me, given the ramp that I had. But just those 2 years of the expectation of mediocrity did real damage. So that's my experience, and it's a big piece of why I educate the way that I do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. There's so much there. Taking away these early leaders that you experienced who grew that awareness of your own genius. So one of my other colleagues says, your own excellence. And I get a sense that that's who you are and what you do for your students and your learning communities. So you honor us by being here and spending some time. And I really appreciate your service. Thank you so much for making time.
Well, thank you for amplifying voices in this work. It's this is another one of those important pieces, beyond writing curriculum, beyond system change. Amplifying these voices is powerful work in moving us in the right path.
Thank you.